Okay, so this is Christ's Charge of Peter. It's a cartoon by Raphael used to set the composition for a tapestry that can now be viewed at the Vatican. Or you can see the original cartoon at the Victoria Albert Museum in London. So the cartoon is a composition intended to be used for another work. And this is Diana Al-Hadid's 2012 work, Divided Line. You can see the influence of Raphael's cartoon in it. You can see the faint figures adopted from his work floating around in places they're supposed to be, but they're not obviously as recognizable as the characters from Raphael's image. This isn't providing us with a clear narrative. Notably, also, it's not a cartoon or a tapestry, it's a wall. It's like part of the architecture of the space. Not a load-bearing wall or anything like that, but a wall. So I guess it's a sculpture, it's architecture. For some loose definition of fresco, I guess we could call it a fresco. But whatever it is, it's cool, and it's the subject of today's video. So let's start with the cartoon. The scene is, as Raphael's title suggests, Christ charging Peter with the responsibility of leading his flock after he's gone. In the book of Matthew, Christ says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." And later in the book of John, he asks Peter if he loves him, and when he gets confirmation, Christ responds, "Feed my sheep." In both cases, Jesus is giving special authority to Peter. He's giving that authority through symbols. In Matthew, he uses the metaphor of a rock. Peter is symbolically a rock, and the term church symbolically stands for the group of collective people who are Christ's followers, and this church will be symbolically built upon that rock. Peter is a petrological foundation. He also symbolically gets the keys to heaven in the book of Matthew. He's the gatekeeper of heaven, represented by his symbolic possession of keys. Being given the keys is to be given both responsibility and authority. They're loaded objects filled with connotative meaning. And in the book of John, Christ issues the imperative, "Feed my sheep," which, of course, uses the metaphor of Christ as a shepherd who leads a flock of sheep. Sheep being symbolic of innocence because, they're white, and the color white is culturally encoded as pure since, it appears unstained and it reflects all visible lights in the spectrum of light, and light is encoded with, I could keep on going with this, but I think we all realize it's just symbols all the way down. And obviously, on a higher level, these symbols are constructed using words written into the books of Matthew and John. And words are also symbols. They're lines on paper or an acoustic vibration in my throat. And when confronted with these lines on the paper or the vibrations, we know that these symbols point towards physical objects like rocks or keys, or concepts like heaven or institutions like the church. That's just how communication works. These are the tools that we've got if we want to communicate ideas to each other. And all these things exist, right? Like rocks, keys, lambs, the color white, and so on. They exist. Or as the philosopher Michel Foucault would say, they are pre-discursive. They exist before we use words to talk about them, before there is discourse. But when we talk about them, when we talk about rocks and keys and lambs or whatever, we apply a layer of discursive meaning onto them. At some point, English speakers all agreed that this animal can be called a lamb, and then by naming something a lamb, we started applying some standard of culturally constructed Platonic idea vision of what a lamb is supposed to be onto it. Once it has a name, it has some characteristics associated with that name. As the 19th century Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure once said, "The bond between a signifier and the signified is arbitrary. There is no reason why a particular word or symbol means what it means. We just all agree that it does so, and then we can communicate ideas with each other more easily." And from there, once we have the name lamb, we can make other observations based on the image in our heads. Like, compared to that image, is it a big lamb, or an old lamb, a dirty lamb, or whatever? What it means to be a lamb is discursively constructed. Its meaning comes from the way that we talk about the word and how we use the word. The expectations we have for lambs are expectations that have been built by an entire landscape of social interactions. Obviously, this is also true for a host of human identifiers as well. The expectations we have when we say the word man, for example, and what it means to be a man. But for now, let's just stick to the symbols Raphael is dealing with in his cartoon and the resulting tapestry. And the resulting wall, sculpture, fresco piece by Diana Al-Hadid. The symbols and discursive meaning in Christ's charge of Peter have been pretty influential. They serve as the justification for having someone serve as the head of the Catholic Church. Like, Peter is considered to be the first pope because of these lines, and the entire institution of the papacy is based on these symbols. Those symbols are a foundation for one of the most influential organizations in world history, an entire hierarchy of power constructed with a few clear and concise statements. That landscape of discursive meaning has serious implications. Like, we all know what it means to be a rock, to be a foundation. We know what it means to be part of a church, or to have the keys to something, or to look over a flock. All these signs point to a particular direction, and in this case, those symbolic meanings have been used to form one of the most successful and resilient institutions in human history, the Catholic Church. So, like, anytime you see a saint with a pair of keys, that's Peter. The papal crest is just a big set of keys. These lines in the Bible meaningfully added to the landscape of this symbol of keys. So now keys, when they appear in a Christian context, reference this interaction between Christ and Peter. So when Raphael's composition of Christ's charge of Peter, along with all of its iconographic discursive meaning, is featured like this, well, that gives us a complicated object to struggle with, so that's what I'm going to do. Like many of her works, Divided Line presents itself dynamically. The wall itself looks ephemeral, as though it's either blinking into being or is being burnt away or melted away by some corrosive or caustic substance. The surface is composed of drips that appear as though they are still liquid, still in motion. And because these drips do not cover the entire surface, you can literally see through it to the other side. And the characters that were so well defined in Raphael's cartoon appear here as apparitions. The composition is maintained, but the details of the figure are only implied. The perspective and foreshortening is maintained, but the characters in the foreground are disappearing. And this is all to say that this piece by Diana Al-Hadid, it looks like a ruin, which I think is part of its aesthetic appeal. We're drawn to ruins for whatever reason. Perhaps we just want to see what has survived from the past, or perhaps maybe we just want to be reminded of the temporality of everything that is terrestrial. Maybe we like being reminded of our own mortality. I don't know. So she's like resurrected this composition of this old Raphael cartoon in an act of creation that evokes the opposite of creation. It evokes ruin and decay. And this is why I spent so long with that structuralist approach to Raphael's cartoon. Diana Al-Hadid's work gives us the space to reflect on the nature of these symbols, how fragile they are, how transparent they can be, even as they do real work in the real world. This piece, as the title suggests, is a dividing line. It's a wall that divides the space. But at the same time, its material existence suggests an uncertainty about that function. It doesn't seem load-bearing. It doesn't actually create a successful visual barrier. It does, however, impact the way that we move around the space. In an interview, the artist once said that the grid of the divided line is depicted with negative space that allows the viewer to see through the wall, in a sense, to see through the image. And I think by seeing through the image, we are asked to see through the way that these symbols are constructed and the impact that they have. This divided line is a dividing line in galleries that impacts the way people move around the gallery. And this is similar to the way that the symbols that we construct and depend on for communication, the discursive understanding that we have of language impacts the way that we actually move around in the world. Language and symbol and connotative meaning are all based on a shared understanding or agreement that those symbols actually mean what they mean. So just as the history behind Raphael's iconography suggests a certain power structure, those symbols are the foundation for having a hierarchy in the church, Al-Hadid's work allows us to think about the way that those foundations are constructed. They may seem unstable, fragile, or temporary when we see through them as arbitrary symbols and concepts, but they last and they impact the way that we move throughout the world. I like what Zandra Eden has said about Al-Hadid's work. She says, "The layer upon layer found in Al-Hadid's work reflects the layer upon layer of history that constitutes the way we perceive the world. Our belief systems, knowledge, and visual language in art and architecture have been built through millennia. but the process of bringing order out of chaos through art by translating the irregular landscape into a perfect system of geometry played a dramatic role in raising the symbolic potency of the dynamic power structures in the Western world, whether in politics or religion. In other words, when we look at an imperfect world and an imperfect visual experience and then use techniques like linear perspective to bring order to that world in a two-dimensional piece like Raphael's, we bring order out of chaos through art. And this order provides power structures in our politics or religion, the power of symbol, the power of communication. And Al-Hadid's work reflects that layered landscape of meaning that supports the dominant power structures. It's a material representation of the way that meaning has been discursively constructed over time. But I don't think that this is done in a cynical way. It can't be. She is, after all, using the symbols from this landscape of meaning to construct something new. This isn't a criticism of how symbols work, it's a reflection of how they work. As Nancy Dahl wrote, her large-scale structures appear as if in a suspended state of either construction or decay. Earlier in this video, I said that Divided Line asked us to consider the symbols that we use to define our everyday experiences unstable, fragile, or temporary. But I could just as easily have said that these symbols are dynamic, in constant motion, in a state of decay and creation at the same time. From a certain point of view, the drips of this composition contribute to the ever-evolving construction of these symbols, and we're catching them in the act of creation. An act that will never fully be complete, always in a state of fluid and dynamic motion of exchange and discourse. And I think that's where I'm going to end this one. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing, and if you want to help support videos like this, please check out my Patreon, link in the description below. Thank you.